Years earlier, Thomas had no company, no employees, no investments, and not even a steady job. So every morning he carried copies of his resume from one company to another, filled out applications, sat through interviews, waited in reception areas, and repeatedly heard the same familiar promises. "We'll call you. We'll review your application. We'll keep your resume on file." But the call never came. One afternoon, after spending hours walking between companies and leaving resumes behind, Thomas became so exhausted that he entered a public park, sat on a bench, pulled out a simple sandwich he had bought on the way, and stopped for a few minutes just to recover from another unsuccessful day. While he was eating, he noticed several workers wearing matching uniforms, carrying cleaning equipment, collecting trash, cleaning pathways, and maintaining the park, and it was obvious that they worked for a professional company responsible for keeping the area clean. Thomas watched them for a while, and then he started remembering all the offices he had visited during the previous weeks, including their reception areas, hallways, meeting rooms, bathrooms, and workspaces, until a simple thought suddenly occurred to him. Every one of those businesses needed cleaning, whether they were hiring new employees or not. For months, Thomas had been entering companies carrying a resume and asking, "Do you have a job for me?" But as he looked at the cleaning workers across the park, he realized that perhaps he had been asking businesses the wrong question all along. Instead of asking them to create an opportunity for him, he could return and ask, "Do you need someone to clean your office after working hours?" Nothing about Thomas's financial situation had changed that afternoon because he still had very little money, still had no job, and still did not know whether any company would say yes. But for the first time in months, he went home carrying something more valuable than another promise of employment. He went home with an idea. Thomas could not afford to rent an office, buy a company vehicle, hire a team, or invest thousands of dollars into starting a business. So instead of waiting until he had enough money to build the perfect company, he decided to start with the smallest version of the idea he could actually afford. He bought basic cleaning supplies, printed a few simple business cards containing his name, phone number, and the service he offered, and then returned to several of the same companies where he had previously asked for employment. This time, however, he was not carrying a resume and asking someone to solve his problem. He was carrying a solution and asking whether their business had a problem he could solve. The first company said no, the second company said no, and several others showed very little interest. But Thomas gradually understood that he did not need 10 companies to accept his offer, because one small client would be enough to prove that the idea could work. Eventually, a small office agreed to give him a chance. So Thomas arrived after the employees had gone home, cleaned the office himself, returned the next evening to do it again, and slowly turned that single customer into his first source of steady income. Then another company hired him. One client recommended his service to another business, and the number of offices he cleaned gradually began to grow, until Thomas was earning more money than he had ever earned while waiting for someone else to employ him. Each time the business produced more income, Thomas faced the same choice. He could immediately spend the additional money upgrading his lifestyle, or he could use part of it to make the business stronger and create more future income. Thomas chose to buy better equipment, keep some money in savings for emergencies, and reinvest another portion of the profit into finding new customers, which meant that although his lifestyle slowly became more comfortable, his business was growing much faster than his personal spending. That difference would eventually change his entire life. One evening, Thomas arrived at one of his clients' offices after the employees had gone home and was preparing his cleaning equipment when he suddenly heard someone knocking at the door. When Thomas opened it, he saw a young man standing outside holding a resume and asking whether he could apply for a job with the company. So Thomas explained that everyone had already left and suggested that he return the following morning. The young man thanked him and began walking away, but as Thomas watched him leave with the resume still in his hand, something about the scene felt painfully familiar. Not long before that moment, Thomas himself had been walking from office to office carrying resumes, knocking on doors, waiting for interviews, and hoping that somebody would eventually give him one opportunity to prove himself. Thomas looked back at the cleaning equipment beside him and realized that although his business was still small and he was still personally cleaning offices every evening, he had recently reached a point where there was more work than he could comfortably complete alone. He called the young man back and asked, "Would you be interested in working evenings?" That evening, Thomas hired his first employee, and although neither of them realized it at the time, that simple decision became the beginning of something much larger. Soon there was a second employee, then a third, more cleaning contracts followed, and over time, the small service Thomas had started with basic supplies, and one client grew into a real company employing other people. Thomas later used part of the profits to enter other businesses and investments, which meant that the same man who had once walked into companies asking someone to give him a job had eventually become someone capable of creating jobs for others. But as Thomas became wealthier, something unexpected happened. His businesses became more visible, while his personal need to look wealthy became smaller. Years later, Adam met Thomas for the first time. On Adam's first day at the company, he stood beside a simply dressed man near the elevator and assumed he was just another employee. But when the doors opened on the executive floor, two senior managers were waiting. "Good morning, Mr. Thomas. The board is waiting for you." Thomas stepped out, leaving Adam stunned. The ordinary-looking man beside him was the founder and owner of the company. And one question stayed in Adam's mind. Why would someone who could afford almost anything choose to look so ordinary? Over the following weeks, Adam noticed that Thomas lived comfortably and enjoyed his money, but rarely spent it simply to attract attention. Inside his businesses, however, Adam saw something very different. New equipment, new employees, expanding projects, and more investments. Thomas's lifestyle grew slowly. What he was building grew much faster. One day, Adam asked him why. Thomas replied with a question. What can this money become? A larger amount of money could become a more expensive car. Or it could become equipment, an investment, financial security, a new project, or another employee's salary. Thomas wasn't against spending. He simply understood that every dollar had more than one possible future. So instead of asking only, "Can I afford this?" he also asked, "What else could this money create?" Later, while having lunch, Thomas noticed a man proudly showing his friends pictures of his new luxury car. Thomas quietly told Adam, "Some people use money to become more visible. I use money to become more free." You can see someone's expensive car, clothes, house, or vacations. But you cannot see their debt, savings, emergency fund, investments, or how long they could live without another paycheck. Someone can look rich while living under constant financial pressure. Someone else can look completely ordinary while quietly building financial freedom. Several months later, Adam traveled with Thomas to one of his projects. On the way back, Thomas stopped at a modest school. Children ran toward him, and the teachers welcomed him warmly. Adam soon discovered that Thomas had helped finance the school, provide educational resources, and support families in the surrounding community. But there was something strange. Thomas's name was nowhere. No sign, no photograph, no plaque. Adam finally asked, "If you helped build this place, why isn't your name anywhere?" Thomas looked toward the children and said, "Because I didn't help build this school so people would remember my name. I helped build it so these children could build theirs." And suddenly, Adam understood. Thomas wanted his money to create more than attention. He wanted it to create freedom, security, opportunity, and impact. Thomas enjoyed his money and improved his lifestyle over time. But whenever his income increased, he didn't immediately turn every extra dollar into another expense. He saved more, invested more, strengthened his financial security, and then spent more on the things he genuinely valued. Before you leave, ask yourself one question. Would you still want it if nobody could see you owning it? Because real wealth isn't always about what people can see. It's about what you build behind the scenes. And from the next story, we're going deeper. We'll uncover real stories of how famous people, entrepreneurs, and creators built their wealth from the ground up, the decisions they made, the risks they took, and the lessons behind their success. So subscribe, because the next story might completely change how you think about money, success, and building wealth. Learn from those who built it. I'll see you in the next story. Goodbye.